In 1997, when she was 83 years old, she sold her collection of papers at an auction to raise money for an eye operation. Today, her daughter is here to share this story, which is the subject of this book. It is called The Nazi Officer's Wife.
What if I told you some Nazi wives escaped justice by raising the next generation of sympathizers? Today, we uncover the untold story of how these women not only survived, but rewrote history. We will chart the post-war fates and hidden legacies of women who once wielded power at the Reich's heart, from Gerda Bormann's desperate bid to shield 10 children, including 5 abducted by her husband at the war's height, to how Henriette von Schirach confronted Hitler over deportation orders and was expelled from his inner circle. Brace yourselves for a journey into the shadows where silence wields its power. The bunker deaths, Eva Braun and Magda Goebbels. While Berlin burned in its final conflagration, 2 women chose death over defeat. But was it loyalty or desperation? Imagine sweeping aerial shots of a capital engulfed in flames and smoke. Then the camera plunges into the Earth's belly, where steel doors guard the Führer bunker. Here, the final gasps of a crumbling empire echoed through tiled corridors. Guards paced in exhaustion as broadcast speakers crackled messages of ruin. Above ground, the Red Army's artillery rattled stone and bone. Beneath it all, 2 figures moved with solemn purpose. One had followed Hitler through exaltation and disgrace. One would end her days at his side. Their last choices would stand as epic, shattering moments and a testament to devotion that defied survival. Eva Braun spent her final hours in a subterranean world of steel and shadows. She had arrived in April 1945, stepping from Munich's sunlit boulevards into the bunker's suffocating gloom. Hitler attempted to persuade her to leave. She refused every entreaty. Flickering lights danced across bullet-pocked walls as her silhouette appeared in the narrow hallways. Her gaze flickered between affection and dread as the world outside crumbled into ash. Each step she took matched his own sense of finality. On the afternoon of April 29th, the Führer's staff gathered for an intimate ceremony. Joseph Goebbels presided over a civil marriage whose only witnesses were panic and despair. Eva signed her name with a trembling hand, then inked over the capital H to become Eva Hitler. Outside, the world collapsed in the thunderous assault. By midnight, the party had shattered. She bit a cyanide capsule. Then came the single crack of a pistol. A Reich died alongside its last bride. Magda Goebbels confronted her destiny in the Führer bunker with a resolve as cold as winter steel. She had spent weeks contemplating the fate of her 6 children when defeat loomed. She confided that she would rather see them dead than be jeered by a vengeful world. Offers to smuggle them out flowed in from Albert Speer and others. She turned away every plea. Instead, she escorted her eldest son and daughter into the bunker's subterranean cells. An SS dentist injected morphine to stop their hearts. Magda administered cyanide capsules to each tiny mouth without faltering. Each child lay still, innocence stolen by a mother's unwavering resolve. She arranged their nightgowns in long white rows, combed their hair, and placed ribbons where innocence once bloomed. In the morning, she and Joseph ascended to the Chancellery Garden. There, they chose a sudden death in silent unison. The bunker's hush became history's final indictment. Magda's choice carved a chasm between maternal instinct and unyielding ideology that still chills the soul. Historians and ethicists continue to debate whether any path remained besides oblivion for a woman bound by fanatic vows. The question endures across generations. Could she have sought asylum rather than descend into irreversible darkness? Would exile have demanded more courage than her final act of annihilation? Such questions hang heavy in the air. What would you do when every sanctuary closes its doors? Could a mother sacrifice her own children to preserve an idea? The ghost of their final breath still haunts history's darkest corridors. But what about those who survived? How did they escape judgment? She fled with stolen children, posing as a saint. Meet the Nazi wife who weaponized motherhood. Gerda Borman, the kidnapper in disguise. Silence draped the Austrian valleys as the Third Reich collapsed. At the heart of the ruins, Gerda Borman slipped northward with a procession of 10 children in tow. 5 were hers by blood. 5 were claimed by her husband's greed. Documents lay forged in her hands. The children's identities dissolved in the chaos. Her footsteps echoing through mountain passes bore witness to cold ambition. Yet behind each small face lay a stolen story waiting to be retold. Gerda's escape did not unfold by chance. The Jewish Virtual Library reveals her meticulous blueprint drawn from the dying embers of a collapsing empire. She acquired blank documents through covert channels. She inscribed names that never belonged to living souls. She claimed the mantle of a children's home director with unflinching resolve. That illusion unlocked sealed mountain passes meant only for the desperate. Time magazine chronicles the phantom convoy that accompanied her flight. Crates filled with looted masterpieces, bonds minted in stolen fortunes, and records of coerced labor. She secured a legacy built on countless stolen lives. Mercy never crossed her mind. She never claimed remorse. James Willie's Nazi Wives paints her loyalty as deliberate homage to her husband's dark faith. Each child she carried functioned as a trophy, proclaiming victory over humanity's collapse. Her gait through border checkpoints echoed the confidence of a believer rather than the panic of a fugitive. Modern survivor testimonies recount silent glances cast at her convoy as proof of cruelty unmasked. Archival footage of ragged villagers adjusting to new regimes juxtaposes with her composed posture as she directed her small army. The scars of those forced to labor whisper beneath every stolen toy. Her fanaticism refused extinction even as her world did. Compassion had no refuge amid her crusade. Gerda's flight ended not in exile, but in illness. In early 1946, she succumbed to a swift and brutal cancer. At 39, she lay weakened during a vigil in a Catholic hospice. Her 5 biological children found refuge under a nun's habits, shielded from the truths their mother once helped conceal. The 5 others returned to parents who had wept them absent for years. Historical records reveal no grand reunion ceremonies. Archives hold only sparse notations, as if their stories were too painful to script. The stolen children lived in hushed uncertainty until adulthood, their names restored, yet scars profound. Archival footage whirs to life as dusty black and white frames reveal 10 small faces huddled in a battered truck. Eyes that edge from innocence to fear flicker beneath dirt and braided hair. Survivor interviews echo in the soundtrack with stories of ragged uniforms and whispered prayers for release. A grandmother's trembling voice remembers a child who never learned her true name. Villagers recall a woman in dark robes offering sugar and lies in equal measure. The contrast between Gerda's serene portrait and the testimonies creates a moral dissonance that no narrator can erase. Images fade to silent ruins. The echoes linger in empty classrooms. Judgment whispers between every frame. The story of Gerda's escape forces a confrontation with culpability. Was she a mere pawn in Martin Bormann's grand design, or an active artisan of suffering? She held the ropes that bound innocence in exchange for her security. She smiled past checkpoints while mothers searched for missing children. She carried lies heavier than any bundle of documents. Each forged signature sealed fates beyond measure. The haunting question demands an answer from every spectator. This is not history laid to rest. It is a challenge flickering in the mind of every witness. Was she a victim of her husband, or his accomplice? The mountain passes that once bore her hurried footsteps now lie silent and overgrown. No plaque marks the scattered graves of those she loved and those she betrayed. History will recall the tyrant's bride, but the children she carried hold the truest testament of her deeds. In their faces, the questions she refused to answer still flickered. We peer back into that moment of collapse to weigh her innocence or guilt. Every detail of her flight reminds us that morality can be weaponized. Time has not softened her legacy. We confront our own definitions of survival. However, not all wives stayed silent. One dared to confront Hitler and paid the price. She broke ranks, challenged the Führer, and lived to tell the tale. But at what cost? Henriette von Schirach, the wife who questioned Hitler. On the evening of June 24, 1943, Henriette von Schirach slipped into Hitler's mountain retreat and bore witness to the brutal roundup of Jewish women in Amsterdam. She summoned the courage to demand an explanation in front of a dozen high-ranking officers. His reply landed like a hammer. "You are sentimental." That phrase shattered her husband's standing and banished the Schirachs from Berlin's inner circle. The corridors that once echoed with their privilege fell silent. An SS wife had exposed the regime's cruelty and paid the price. Did she speak from moral conviction or a desperate bid to salvage her family's future? The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Baldur von Schirach, once Hitler's favored youth leader, found himself sidelined and humiliated. Henriette was escorted from the capital, her aristocratic grace replaced by the exile's unsteady stride. Nuremberg media recounts how she watched her social network collapse around her, hotels refusing her name, and old friends crossing the street to avoid her gaze. Yet even in disgrace, she retained one weapon: her story. She carried the memory of that fateful confrontation like a burdened heirloom. Was her exile an act of punishment, or the first step in a quiet rebellion? After the war, Henriette retraced her own steps through ink and paper. In her 1956 memoir, The Price of Glory, she painted the Führer as a callous tyrant who sneered at humanity itself. Later volumes, Anecdotes About Hitler and Women Around Hitler, offered selective remembrance, rewriting her proximity to power as an uneasy partnership rather than willing complicity. Voiceover of her own lines played over faded Berghof footage could convince any viewer of her remorse. Yet Tocqueville 21's review of Nazi Wives by James Willey warns of self-fashioned narratives. Was her confession genuine or a survival tactic crafted for denazification courts and post-war opinion? Denazification felt like another trial by fire. Classified initially as a Group 2 offender, she faced fines, probation, and the daily task of cleaning prison toilets with flags bearing Hitler Youth insignia. Sources online draw on court records to show her public humiliation in Bad Tölz, children torn from her arms and lodged with a grandmother who beat them for bearing the name Schirach. Yet, within a decade, she reclaimed her father's art collection and even repurchased the Schloss Aspenstein at a fraction of its value. Her legal maneuvers read less like penance and more like the strategies of a savvy survivor. Did she endure indignity or exploit it? Behind closed doors, Henriette shaped a legacy that outlived her silence. She raised her sons under her maiden name, Hoffmann, and under assumed identities, insulating them from the full force of their father's crimes. Her grandson Ferdinand von Schirach would later fund research into these very activities. From exile to memoirs to courtroom victories, she guided the narrative of her family's past, turning shame into a shield. That intergenerational web of memory and denial took root in post-war Germany, where whispered loyalties and selective truths flourished in suburban parlors. Could a single voice rewrite history for generations to come? While some wives sought redemption, others doubled down. Meet the unrepentant widows. They lost the war, but kept the faith how two widows kept Nazism alive in the shadows. The unrepentant, Lena Heydrich and Anneliese von Ribbentrop. Lena Heydrich returned to Bavarian soil under a veil of mourning and rebirth. She transformed a remote hunting lodge on Lake Gemund into Heydrich's Hof, a guest house that wore respectability like armor. Under chandeliers filched from aristocratic estates, former SS officers slipped inside in civilian attire and exchanged covert salutations over porcelain cups. Historians note that the preserved fragments of a guest book read like a roll call of men once entrusted with the regime's darkest orders: hospitality, concealed loyalty. In daylight, the lodge appeared to be a refuge for weary travelers. At dusk, it became a sanctuary for those who refused defeat. Evening gatherings at Heydrich's Hof followed a ritual older than defeat itself. Servants dressed in muted uniforms served wine drawn from cellars once stocked by confiscated vineyards. By candlelight, veterans recited speeches delivered at Berghof banquets, while Lena listened from a shadowed alcove. Scholars who have traced extremist networks confirm that pamphlets lionizing the SS circulated in guest rooms long after Allied flags fluttered over Berlin. Should descendants bear the burden of loyalties they never chose? The question lingers in every footstep through those silent corridors. Anneliese von Ribbentrop chose courtrooms over cloaked meetings. Dressed in somber black, she arrived in Munich with folders of appeals and affidavits. She contested every conviction her husband endured, insisting Allied tribunals had stacked charges to satisfy vengeance rather than justice. Legal archives record case after case bearing her signature. each one demanding the erasure of Joseph von Ribbentrop's guilt. Revisionist journals she funded rewrote history in his favor. Memorial lectures she sponsored cast him as a tragic statesman rather than an architect of atrocity. She did not beg for mercy. She demanded rehabilitation. Both women understood that ideology survives where memory falters. Lena fortified her guest house as a crucible for denial. Anneliese deployed the law as a weapon to reshape perceptions. They taught their children to question verdicts written at Nuremberg and to prize pride over shame. Their descendants absorbed a version of the past in which defeat became delay and guilt a mere illusion. Interviews with modern historians reveal that late-night conversations at Heydrichshof seeded the foundations of networks still active today. Should the sins of ancestors echo through generations? Viewers debating in chat rooms have clashed over whether blood can absolve or condemn. Some insist that familial ties demand accountability across time. Others argue that personal identity cannot be tethered to ancestral crimes. This debate propelled polls on history channels and fueled comment section skirmishes. Could you live under a legacy haunted by genocide? Would you fight to clear a name stained by mass murder? The answers expose our own thresholds for justice. Their campaigns blurred the boundaries between mourning and myth-making. Every booklet handed out at Heydrichshof praised forgotten chapters of SS valor. Every courtroom victory by Anneliese chipped away at the collective memory. These gestures transformed denial into doctrine, private defiance into public narrative. Memory became their inheritance, while denial was their doctrine. Their efforts etched lines between fact and fantasy deeper than any battlefield trench. History remembers widows draped in black, not conspirators draped in secrecy. Many names vanished when lodges closed and courtrooms emptied. Some escaped under false identities across continents. Others settled quietly in villages where no one asked about guest books or dockets. Their silence became a final weapon. Records faded, but influence endured in whispers, legal footnotes, and family lore. But what about the wives who vanished? The ones history forgot? Forgotten faces. Mafalda of Savoy and Margaret Himmler. History remembers the uniforms, the medals, and the monsters who fought it. But tucked between royalty's bloodlines and the regime's shadows lies a different kind of silence. The kind that you do not hear in classrooms. The kind that even survivors hesitate to name. One of Hitler's prisoners was a princess. Yes, you heard that right. Mafalda of Savoy, daughter of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, was not meant to be behind barbed wire. She was meant to wear silk, not suffer under the weight of ash and iron. Yet, in September 1943, the Allied invasion of Italy fractured loyalties and upended the monarchy. Mafalda's husband, Prince Philip of Hesse, had once been a key Nazi ambassador. But when Italy switched sides and declared war on Germany, the princess became a liability, a symbol. And symbols, in Nazi Germany, were often sentenced to disappear. She was lured into a trap in Nazi-occupied Rome and promised a meeting with her husband. Instead, she was arrested by the SS and shuttled, quietly, without trial, to Buchenwald. There, she became prisoner number 47,615. The camp guards were instructed not to treat her as royalty, and they did not. Her quarters were cramped, and surveillance was constant. She endured months of rationing, isolation, and illness. In August 1944, the Allies bombed a nearby munitions plant. Mafalda, trapped inside a collapsing building, suffered severe injuries. Infections set in. Her arm was amputated without anesthesia. Days later, she died, abandoned in a Nazi infirmary. Her death was not announced. There was no procession, no crown or vigil, just a coded telegram to Berlin, confirming that the Italian woman had succumbed to her wounds. Some historians insist she was targeted deliberately, punished not just for her country's betrayal, but for her bloodline. Others suggest she was collateral, caught in a system that devoured both enemies and allies without distinction. Either way, Mafalda's death shattered the illusion that birthright could shield one from the Reich's revenge. But while Mafalda vanished behind barbed wire, another woman quietly watched the war collapse from inside her home. Margareta Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, the man who orchestrated the final solution. You might imagine a woman married to such darkness would be forced into hiding, stripped of power and marked. But that is not quite what happened. When Berlin fell in 1945, Margaret was arrested by American forces. Her initial statements painted her as a loyal wife with no true understanding of her husband's crimes. She claimed to have only seen what she was shown, to have merely played hostess. But investigators were not entirely convinced. Margaret had joined the Nazi Party long before Hitler took power. She was a trained nurse, an educated woman, and one of the regime's quiet social climbers. And she knew more than she ever admitted. Photos from the 1930s show her dining with top SS officers. Her diary, unearthed years later, reveals bitter resentment toward Jews and a fascination with racial hygiene. Still, she was never charged with war crimes. Released from internment, she retreated to a quiet life in Munich. There, she worked as a midwife, avoided reporters, and raised her daughter, Gudrun, to remember her father not as a mass murderer, but as a misunderstood patriot. Gudrun would go on to become one of post-war Germany's most vocal neo-Nazi sympathizers. Coincidence or inheritance? Margarete Himmler never returned to public life, but she did not need to. Through silence, through motherhood, through memory, she shaped the future. So, where do we draw the line between victimhood and complicity? Is Mafalda, royal, imprisoned, and mutilated, innocent because she died in Nazi chains? Is Margaret, socialite, survivor, and whisperer of sanitized legacies, guilty because she lived? These stories are not easy. They are not clean, but they matter because history does not just live in the headlines. It echoes in the homes of survivors and lingers in the bedtime stories told by those who never stopped believing in the cause, and sometimes even hides in the lullabies sung by mothers who never admitted what they truly knew. Their silence spoke volumes. But what happened to the children they left behind, raised on lies, haunted by truth? How the next generation grappled with their mother's sins is simply heartbreaking. The children of complicity, legacy of denial. The war ended. The bunkers fell. Trials were held. But something darker remained, unspoken, unresolved. It seeped into family dinners, bedtime stories, and photo albums. For the children of Nazi leaders, history wasn't just a lesson, it was a bloodline. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief behind the final solution, embraced her father's legacy. She defended his name with pride, joining Stille Hilfe, a secretive group supporting former SS members and war criminals. To Gudrun, the Holocaust was fiction, her father a patriot. Even in her final years, she attended neo-Nazi rallies, unrepentant until her death in 2018. Not all children followed this path. Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the butcher of Krakow, chose confrontation. His father ruled Nazi-occupied Poland, where millions were enslaved and killed. Niklas, burdened by his surname and legacy, did the opposite of Gudrun. He publicly condemned his father, calling him a murderer and Nazi pig. In the Shadow of the Reich, he exposed the horrors of his upbringing. His rage wasn't performative, it was raw grief. Where Gudrun preserved her past, Niklas tried to burn his down. Yet both were shaped by the same truth. Raised on lies, haunted by history. Could you forgive a parent responsible for genocide? Forgiveness implies understanding. But how can one understand such evil? Some children denied the truth. Others tried to make peace with it. Most were caught in between, torn by love for their parents and the horrors their names invoke. Take Gerda Bormann, wife of Hitler's right-hand man, Martin Bormann. After the war, she fled with their children and 5 kidnapped kids, abducted by her husband to aid her cover story. Her children grew up with a mother who justified lies and kidnapping. What does that do to one's sense of truth? Post-war German society rarely asked. Wives of Nazi officials were hidden away. Children were told their fathers were misunderstood, their crimes exaggerated. Some accepted this, others revolted. Many were left with a story stitched together from denial and silence. Anneliese von Ribbentrop, widow of Hitler's foreign minister, never gave up on Nazi ideals. She worked to clear her husband's name and, reportedly, fed her children myths about the Reich's glory. Behind closed doors, quiet indoctrination continued. This part of history is rarely taught. The war may have ended at Nuremberg, but its echoes lived on, in family myths, unspoken guilt, and inherited shame. Nazi wives often shaped their children's understanding, reframing horror into heroism. Henriette von Schirach was exiled by Hitler for questioning the treatment of Jews. Yet, even that didn't break her loyalty. After the war, she still referred to Hitler as the center of our lives. Today, descendants of the Nazi elite live scattered across Germany, Austria, Argentina. Some speak, most stay silent. A few deny it all. But the question remains, lingering in the silence of history. Could you still love someone who orchestrated genocide? These children did not choose their legacy, but they chose how to live with it. Some clung to the myth, others tore it down. But they all carried the burden of silence that their mothers once mastered so well. The war ended, but the guilt didn't. So, did these wives truly escape justice? Justice denied? Denazification's empty promises. They kept their loot, their homes, their freedom. Was denazification a failed experiment? After the gunfire ceased and the flags were torn down, the world looked to Germany and asked one question: what now? Justice, many believed, would be swift. But behind courtroom doors and bureaucratic titles, another reality took shape, one where silence was currency and survival often required a performance of innocence. The wives of Nazi leaders were not tried as soldiers. They were classified instead. Some are major offenders, followers, and others even beneficiaries. Terms were crafted not to assign guilt, but to manage post-war order. Legal labels that could be negotiated, softened, or escaped entirely. Take Emmy Goering, wife of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, Nazi Germany's golden boy turned war criminal. Before the war, Emmy was a celebrated actress, draped in jewels and mingling with diplomats. After the war, she was briefly imprisoned, then released, reclassified, and quietly returned to a life of privilege. Her seized assets, many of them acquired through looted Jewish estates, were eventually returned. She spent her final years in a luxurious Munich apartment, sipping coffee on a balcony built from stolen lives. There were no protesters outside her door, no reparations or shame whatsoever. And Emmy was not alone. Time magazine details how countless Nazi wives reclaimed their properties, reinvented their reputations, and resumed lives of comfort. Some even earned public sympathy as widows of lost men. Few were imprisoned. Fewer still expressed remorse. Their complicity, deeply entwined with the spoils of genocide, remained unexamined. They wore couture sewn by slave labor and decorated their salons with art stolen from murdered families, even vacationed in villas confiscated from Jews who never returned. Still, when the denazification committees convened, many were categorized as unaware. They smiled sweetly and denied everything. Wikipedia outlines how the system itself, bogged down by political priorities and Cold War tensions, rapidly softened. The Allies needed a stable Germany, not a guilt-ridden one. Former Nazis returned to government jobs. Their wives hosted dinner parties, not interrogations. The myth grew that these women were simply housewives, some mothers, and others even hostages to history. But was that ever true? Many of these women had joined the Nazi Party on their own accord. They attended rallies. They socialized with high-ranking SS officers. They signed off on household purchases made with stolen Jewish wealth. And after 1945, they became the architects of a new narrative, one where they were victims too, and the history blurred. Beneficiaries often rebranded themselves as caretakers of family honor. They filed claims, sued for assets, and lobbied behind closed doors. Some even defended the Third Reich until their dying breath. So let us ask the should Nazi wealth be seized generations later? If the descendants of victims still grieve without restitution, why should the descendants of perpetrators live undisturbed? This is not about vengeance. It is about memory and justice, not just handed down by courts, but carried by conscience. Because when history allows silence to settle, ideology does not die. It mutates, rebrands, and sometimes hides in the same gilded estates where the regime once raised its glass. The denazification process promised to purge a nation, but in truth, it dusted the furniture and kept the house standing. From the crumbling bunkers of Berlin to the quiet villas of Bavaria, this story has traveled far, but its weight remains. These women did not just survive the Reich. They carried it forward, through silence, inheritance, and stories whispered to children who would decide whether to forget or to fight. Some rewrote history to cleanse it. Others inherited its stains and turned them into a purpose. So the next time you hear the phrase, "never again," remember, it is not just the bullets we must stop. It is the bedtime stories, the unspoken loyalties, and the luxury built on bones. Because sometimes the truth is not buried in archives. It is living in someone's living room. Ciao!